Welcome to the Gurion podcast, an in-depth look at chareidi society, Israel, and the Jewish people. I am your host, Ari Koretsky, and I invite you to join us as we confront the challenges, joys, and possibilities of Torah-centered living in an evolving world. The Gurion podcast. Welcome back, friends. Again. On November 19th, 2025, Rabbi Nathaniel, or Nati, Helfgot, a congregational rabbi and Judaics teacher at SAR in Riverdale, wrote an article at the Lehrhaus titled Gurion and Hazon Ish, the sequel. In the article, Rabbi Helfgot traces the history of the iconic encounter between these secular political and chareidi leaders, respectively, in the state of Israel's earliest days. He then proceeds to document the little-known continuing correspondence between the two figures. This encounter, both the actual historical event and its larger metaphorical import, helps us understand the origins of the ideological fault lines that remain entrenched today, despite a heavily altered demographic landscape. We also examine ways in which chareidi norms have shifted since October 1952, and how the meaning in question might inform relations in our current moment. So now, to explore this fascinating encounter between David Ben-Gurion and the Chazon Ish and its aftermath, we turn to our conversation with Rabbi Nati Helfgot. We are here with Rabbi Nathaniel, or Nati Helfgot, coming to us right now, I think, from SAR, Salanter, Akiva, Riverdale Academy, where he's the chair of the Talmud department, if I got that correct. How are you, Rabbi Helfgot?
Good. I'm happy. Hanukkah Sameach. Happy Hanukkah. I'm actually two small corrections. We're in the high school. SAR High School, and I just retired from being department chair of the Gemara department. So I passed it on to someone else. So I'm just back to being a regular mechanech, regular teacher, Rebbe, Judaic studies faculty, whatever you want to call it. And I also do some work for, we have a think tank here affiliated with the school called Machon Siach. So I do a little bit more of that and less of that administration stuff.
Fabulous. Is Machon Siach built around Jewish educational thought? Yes. Or what do they work on exactly?
Yeah, Machon Siach started about 10 years ago. Our principal, Rabbi Hartstart, he wanted to create like something between, like a purely academic think tank and just a place where people are thinking about what's the next lesson I'm going to teach, or what's the next shiur I'm going to teach, but something where teachers who are given time and a little bit of money to sit and reflect and write and discuss on issues that are, very important in education, to do a little bit of research, but also very practical, try to focus in on what's going on in the classroom and how that's going to play out. And like on topics like, what does it mean to be a frum Jew, but also really involved in citizenship? What does it mean to be a fully involved American? Issues related to Israel and Zionism. Are we teaching it the right way? Are we not teaching it the right way? Issues revolve around sexuality and kids today, and all those, like, can we do some real, research and thinking and discussion and cohorts, or how we're teaching Gemara, or teaching Tanakh, so like to give like a little bit step away from the day to day, but also, so that's what the think tank is about. There's a website about it if people want to look at it.
Very interesting. So, and is part of the idea to export the findings to other educational institutions?
Yes. So some of it has been to export it, and some of it actually has been out of this whole thing came a few years ago, this thing, I don't know if you've heard about it, called GGC, Guiding Conversations, which a number of yeshiva high schools have started to adopt, where they have like this very interesting like protocol of like getting together with parents and students and like encouraging them to talk about their values and planning, so like, what do I do when I'm at a party? What do I do when I'm going to confront this dilemma and talk about it, and really have these sessions about with parents and kids together with facilitator, like during the course of the year. And a number of schools have adopted this model, which was imported from other schools, non-Jewish schools, but it's it's a good thing.
Fascinating. Okay, well, moving on to what we're really talking about today, as interesting as all the educational theory is, we're here because you wrote a fascinating article that I came across in the Lehrhaus. And the Lehrhaus, Lehrhaus.com, is not typically, I would say, a source of articles that we would really be featuring on a podcast focusing on the chareidi community and its relationship to Israeli society. Typically, it's dealing with different kinds of issues and coming often from a different philosophical orientation. But you wrote a really, really interesting article in November of this year, of 2025, and talking about really a foundational encounter between two of the most influential and important figures in the early state of Israel, although two very, very different people, one being David Ben Gurion and one being Rabbi Yeshaya Karelitz, the Chazon Ish. And the encounter that they had, as well as the lesser known and little known sort of follow-ups to that encounter and the interactions that they had on an ongoing basis that is really not spoken about even by those who are aware of the original conversation that the two of them had. So let's just sort of rewind first and tell us, first of all, how did you end up writing this article? Why this article? How did you come across even this topic as something to explicate?
Okay, so it's an excellent back. Let's go back. So I've always been. I'm not personally chareidi. That's not the way I grew up. That's not the way I lived my life. But I was always very fascinated by the chareidi community, and especially as it keeps growing. I think that every person, besides obviously on a family level and as part of the Am Yisrael and Jewish people, the chareidi community is a very central part of Am Yisrael. So that's number one. Number two, I have a lot of chareidi friends and chareidi relatives, and so it's something that's part of my ultimate connections. But also, I've always been fascinated since I was a kid about the chareidi community. People just the hashkafat olam, the hashkafa and the approach, and where are they coming from? Because I'm so not like that. Just to understand people, even if I disagree with them, I really think it's important to understand where people are coming from, what their assumptions are, where they got to where they got to. I'm also a Jewish history buff, so you can't understand the chareidi community without understanding the past and what led them as a community to understand. And so to me, I've always fascinated. And when I was a kid, I always heard this story in different circles. Oh, the famous story, the Ben Gurion meeting the Chazon Ish. And so I had a very vague understanding of it. And then a few years ago, I read an excellent book. I don't know if it's out in English or not, but it was written in Hebrew by a professor, Benny Brown, in Israel, called Hagdolim. I don't know if you've seen it, if you've mentioned it, but it's like a 700-page book where it goes through, it's a collection of essays on various great Gedolei Yisrael who he and the other editors identified basically modern day Gedolim from the time of the Enlightenment that really shaped the character of the chareidi community, whether the Ashkenazi chareidi community, the Hasidic chareidi community, the Sephardic chareidi community. And he has a very wonderful chapter there about the Chazon Ish. I also read his book about the Chazon Ish. He wrote also a 700-page book about the Chazon Ish, which is also fascinating. And so, and there he really outlines a tremendous amount of the history and the details. He did a lot of research. He read the journals of Ben Gurion. He read all the letters of the Chazon Ish. He read the letters of people who were close to the Chazon Ish. He read the letters of the people who were close to Ben Gurion. And so you get a real sense of, what was going on in the early years of the state, when the chareidi community was very small and was very much on the defensive, in a way that, today seems very different, even though it's still in many ways acts as it's very much on the defensive, even though it's, 1 million people strong. It's not like a little Nebuch community that everyone thinks is going to die out, as opposed to in 1949, where they all think it's all going to disappear within a generation.
So sketch for us briefly, if you can, in the broadest terms, who was Ben Gurion and who was the Chazon Ish? And of course, Chazon Ish is not his actual name. It's the way he signed his letters, right? You can tell us a little bit about that as well. But who were these two, again, very different, but both sort of titanic figures early in the middle of 20th century?
Right. So Ben Gurion comes from the mainstream of the labor Zionist movement, which, in the 20s and 30s comes to dominate. They become the most dominant force in the fledgling, growing, what they call the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael, the Yishuv, whatever you pronounce. I'm going to pronounce words. I'm going to be inconsistent. Sorry. So, so sometimes I'll pronounce Ashkenazi, sometimes I'll pronounce Sfaradit. So Ben Gurion comes out of and he's really, in the 20s, he's just another Zionist figure. He's but he works very hard. He's very capable. He's very charismatic. And he rises to the top of the what becomes the Jewish agency. He rises to the top of the, so to speak, government in waiting of what eventually will become, the government when the state is actually created. And he represents, so to speak, a kind of the classic, labor Zionist belief in socialism, in, very much connection to Eretz Yisrael. Ben Gurion loved Tanakh. Ben Gurion loved, and even when he became prime minister, he had these sessions in his residence of Tanakh scholars that would come to meet once a month. And he loved that, and that was his main kesher to Judaism. He wasn't a halachic in the sense of he didn't practice much what we would call classical Yiddishkeit, but he very much saw the Zionist movement as the return to the land. He used to say, the famous statement, "Min haTanach el haPalmach," skipping most of Jewish history to the Palmach, which was the, so to speak, the elite forces of the Haganah, which became the backbone of eventually Tzahal, of the IDF, when the state was created. So Ben Gurion represents, and during, the 1930s and the 40s, the dominant ethos in the country, because of the dominant people who came to make Aliyah, the Aliyah Aleph and Aliyah Bet were not religious. They were in many ways rebelling against the worldview that was represented by most of the religious community, which was much more what we call quietist, much more not be activist, don't push too much, not to push the umot ha'olam, not to push the nations. And the Zionist movement had a very different perspective. We need to become like all other nations. We need to go back to the land. We need to have an army. We need to have a state. We can't rely on God. Even whether we believe in God or we don't believe in God, we can't rely on God. And we need to do our own thing. And so Ben Gurion becomes the head of the Zionist movement. And eventually when the state is created, he becomes the head of the state. He's the prime minister. He is a beloved and revered figure across and very powerful figure across political lines. Until Bibi, he was the prime minister who had the most administrations, the most time to be prime minister. So he represents kind of the secular ideal, the Zionism on in the rise. The old world of chareidi Judaism will be left, behind, and so comes the creation of the state of Israel. The first year there was a tremendous amount of unity because the state is under attack. For 2,000 years, we haven't had a state. Even figures who today we consider very chareidi were very much swept up with the fervor, and they believed very strongly. Those first 2 years, there was what was called the Chazita Datita Me'uchedet. All the religious parties ran together. Aguda and Mizrahi, everybody ran together in the first Knesset. Eventually, they split, and so that's Ben Gurion, and he's the prime minister at the time. He's the dominant power. He represents Israel, the new Israeli, the Israeli who's, so to speak, going to push away the Golah, push away the Galut, rejects the Galut. The new suntanned Israeli who's going to take, destiny in their own hands. We're going to create an army. We're going to create a state. We're going to have connection to the Jewish past, but not a religious connection necessarily. We're going to defend ourselves. We need an army. We need everybody in the army, etc. And as you know, I'm sure you may even have talked about it, I don't know, in that first year during the war of independence, many people who today would be considered chareidi fought in the war. Even Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, there's a picture of him holding a rifle, when he was a soldier for a few weeks, because everybody they had such a small, it was 600,000 Jews surrounded by so many hostile Arab nations and hostile Arab locals, and so everybody pitched in. Okay, so that's on the one hand, Ben Gurion and what he represents. And Ben Gurion in the early 1950s is at the height of his power. He is the prime minister. Israel is this new fledgling state. The Zionist movement has fulfilled its dream. Herzl's dream in Im tirtzu ein zo agada. If you will it, it's not a dream, it's not a legend, has been fulfilled. People never believed it would happen. Who's the Chazon Ish? Chazon Ish is a fascinating figure, Rav Avram Yishaya Karelitz. He is a tremendous Talmid Chacham, but he is very unknown in Europe. He lives in Vilna. He lives and he learns by himself. He's not one of those people who goes to yeshiva. He's not like a product of Slobodka or of Volozhin or of Mir, some of the great Rosh Yeshivas that we know from the 20th century. He is a product of learning with his parents, his father, learning with other private rabbeim. And nobody knows him. He's anonymous. Reb Chaim Oizer Grzinski, Reb Chaim Oizer, the great Rav of Vilna, discovers him, so to speak, and gets involved, asks him to be involved in Shilas, and he starts to publish Svarim anonymously in the late 20s in Vilna under the pseudonym Chazon Ish. Ish is Avram Yeshaya, so he starts to publish Svarim, but nobody knows who this Talmid Chacham is, this great Talmid Chacham. A few people know, but he's not really known. In the early 1930s, he makes Aliyah. Again, I don't know a lot of the history of why he decided to make Aliyah. Was it just because that's where you can fulfill more mitzvahs? We don't get the sense that he is a Zionist in any way, but he comes to Eretz Yisrael. If you want to learn a little bit more about him, the famous Yiddish novelist Chaim Grada wrote a series of books in Yiddish. He was a Talmid of the Chazon Ish in Eastern Europe, in Vilna, before the war and before he left Yiddishkeit, before he became not frum. And Chaim Grada has a lot of descriptions of the Chazon Ish. He calls him the Mare Avram in his book. A Mare Avram is the Chazon Ish. And he has a lot of depictions of the Chazon Ish, very, very interesting depictions in his books, the Yeshiva and the Aguna and other books, which he describes, probably the closest we have to description of the Chazon Ish during that period of time. Chazon Ish makes it to Israel. Chazon Ish at the time, is an unknown. He's happy to sit and learn. A few people know him. A few people approach him. He is not necessarily considered one of the most extreme voices within the chareidi community at that time. You have many others. People who eventually become the head of Neturei Karta are still part of the Aguda at the time. There are many more extremist voices. He's a very big supporter of the kibbutzim, of the what's called Poalei Agudas Yisrael. Agudas Yisrael, the Aguda, has a branch which is involved in setting up religious kibbutzim under the Aguda called Poalei Agudas Yisrael. The Hazon Ish is a number of the people involved in that see the Hazon Ish as their Rebbe and as their posek. And so he helps them deal with shilas like how do you take care of cows on Shabbos? How do you milk cows on Shabbos? How do you run a religious kibbutz that wants to be a chareidi religious kibbutz? The Hazon Ish, again, as I said, is really not known in the Yishuv and in Eretz Yisrael circles. There are many more prominent Rabbanim in the 1930s in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, Rav Dushinsky, and many others. The Hazon Ish comes to the fore in the 40s. Around the first time he really takes a stand publicly is when he gets involved in the controversy about the Shanghai, when should they keep Yom Kippur on the boat. And Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank and Rav Herzog and many others give one psak. The Hazon Ish gives a different psak. So he challenges the consensus of the rabbinic elite at the time, but he holds his own. And that's the first time that he really becomes known. And more people in what eventually becomes the chareidi community, which is not really the term that's used at the time. In the 1920s, everybody who's religious is called chareidi. Ha-charedim. Everybody, but slowly by the 50s and 60s, you start to have the divisions between those who are explicitly religious Zionists and those who are not. So the Hazon Ish by the late 40s becomes a very dominant figure within the religious community. He is not the most dominant figure. The Brisker Rav, who escapes Europe and makes it to Eretz Yisrael, is considered the Gadol Hador in the late 1940s and the early 50s in the chareidi community. Others, the Chabina Rav and others, are really, so to speak, Hazon Ish doesn't sit on the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah. He's not an institutional person. He's not like, he was made a Gadol because of Askanim. That's not, he sits and learns and answers shilas and gives advice and writes letters. Okay. So that's kind of a picture of these two titans of reflecting two very different worlds. By nature, the Hazon Ish is not an activist, but people come to him and ask him questions. In the early 1950s, some of the tensions between the secular state of Israel and the religious community start to bubble to the surface in a way that hadn't in the first 2 years. In the first 2 years, people are just, the state has to survive. And so a lot of the tensions don't really come to the fore. But once there's a ceasefire in 1949, and once Israel turns to the business of absorbing, all the refugees from Arab countries and focusing on developing an economy and trying to build its army, then all of a sudden, people have more time to focus on internal debates. So questions about education and what can a state force in terms of education. Questions about giyus, questions about conscription. And now it's not only about conscription of men, which is a very small issue in the 1950s because there's very few yeshivas. And Ben Gurion, in the early years of the state, doesn't really want to fight. And so during the middle of the War of Independence, Ben Gurion wrote the famous letter to the Aguda allowing for the ptur, the exemption of the 600 yeshiva students who are learning full time because, what am I going to make a fight over 600 yeshiva students? The Holocaust has just happened. The centers of Torah have been destroyed. I'm going to make a cause celeb and cause disunity about 600 yeshiva students. The state of Israel will continue if 600 yeshiva students don't fight. It's not the end of the world. And so in 1951, 52, most people who live in what today would be called chareidi neighborhoods are not really chareidi in the way they are today. It's not like there's 50,000 people learning in Kollel till 28, 30, 35, 40. People are going to work. Most people are going to the army for a year or two, whatever they do conscription-wise, and then they go back to their life. The issue bubbles over in 1952 when there's a decision made to conscript young women, to conscript girls, Giyus Banos. That opens up a Pandora's box. And it's at this point that the entire religious community, so to speak, rises up against this decision and against this move. And it's in the midst of that the Hazon Ish emerges as one of the leaders of the nascent chareidi community that's growing in places like Bnei Brak and Yerushalayim as an organized community separate from the rest of the religious community, the religious Zionist community, which is the dominant religious time in Israel, both politically, in terms of the number of seats in the coalition, the Mizrahi versus the Aguda, but also in terms of numbers of adherents, etc., etc. And so now we have this tremendous fight that is going on. The religious community comes out, guns blazing against conscription of girls. And they use language which is very strong, Yehareg Val Yavor, that we're willing to give up our life rather than allow our daughters to be thumb of a secular national state, and girls should not be under the thumb of anybody except their parents. Young girls who are not married should not be in this situation. It's not sneistic. It will lead to hefkerus. It will lead to pritzus. It will lead, again, I don't know if I should be translating these terms or not, or if your audience understands these terms. So it will lead to all kinds of bad results. And it's a line that the chareidi community of the time says cannot be crossed. At this point, there are demonstrations in Israel. There are demonstrations in America. There are demonstrations in front of the Israeli consulate in America, in New York. This is a very big deal, and how will it be handled is very, very unclear. Even the chief rabbinate, which is controlled by the religious Zionist rabbis, Rav Herzog and Rav Uziel and others, they are against the move to conscript the young women. They see it also as inappropriate. However, the religious Zionist community at some point is willing to accept a compromise called Sherut Le'umi, national service, that they won't be under the army, but they'll do some sort of service, but there'll be much more protections for religious young women to be able to maintain their identity and their religiosity and their ability to go home and stuff like that. The chareidi community doesn't accept this, but this is a little bit later down the road. So it's 1952. You have these tremendous fights. And at this point, Ben Gurion wants to find some way to a solution. So as I mentioned before, Ben Gurion, so he turns to some of his political operatives who turn to their friends in the religious community, who turn to their friends in the Chareidi, and they say, who is the top rabbi in the Chareidi community to talk to? Who's the top rabbi? And so they say the Brisker Rav, Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik. When I was growing up, they called him Reb Velvel, but it's not so much in the chareidi community they call him that, but in the YU community they call him Rav Velvel. He's the uncle of Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Rav. So Rav Velvel refuses to meet with Ben Gurion. He refuses to meet with Ben Gurion. And so Ben Gurion says, okay, who's the second top rabbi? So at that point, they turn to the Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish is willing to meet with Ben Gurion to discuss, at least have a meeting. So that's the background of how these two giants, representing two very different worldviews and communities, one which is dominant in terms of numbers, power, political power, money, and control, and one which is just recovering from the ashes of the Holocaust, is able to, that's how the background to what happened, the meeting.
Do we have a sense of why the Brisker Rov would not meet with Ben Gurion?
We don't have enough material. I assume he just, I can conjecture, but I don't have any there's no letters, there's no firsthand accounts. All we know is that he refused to meet with him. The one thing I can think about is Rabbi Soloveitchik, Zichron Livracha, in his hesped for his uncle called Madodech Midod, he has a passage where he talks about how Reb Velvel could not imagine the notion of a secular Jewish state. It didn't fit into his categories. It didn't fit into his categories of thinking. There's either a halachic state or there's not it didn't fit. And so, he wasn't goyresid, as to say in the yeshiva world. It didn't fit in. And so there was nothing to talk about from his perspective. If I'm not mistaken, the Brisker Rov did not take any funds from the state for his institutions. The Chazon Ish, as I mentioned before, was not a kanoi. Even though today people have this image, or maybe it's been, kind of a revisionist history, that the Chazon Ish was this kanoi shebekanoi. He was not perceived in his day as a kanoi. His institutions, or the institutions that he guided or was a poisek for, were very much willing to take funds from the state of Israel. And so he was not, so maybe that's part of why, the Brisker Rov was saw it as, I'm not going to deal with the state. I'm going to do my own thing, and that's it.
So now, set the stage for this initial meeting. What exactly took place? How long was the meeting? What did they discuss? And did anything get resolved as a result?
Right. So it turns out, this meeting in 1952, late 1952, is set up, as I said. Ben Gurion wants to meet with the head of the religious community, and everyone thinks that the meeting is going to be about the issue of conscription for girls. But that's not what they actually talk about. Ben Gurion, I think, maybe thought that this would be the beginning of a set of meetings. But Ben Gurion comes in, he goes to Bnei Brak, he shows respect. He doesn't say the Chazon Ish has to come to, Chazon Ish is older. He comes to Bnei Brak. He meets the Chazon Ish. It's a very well recorded. Everybody knows about it. In its day, it was seen as a very big deal. It was seen as, again, as I said, like the two worlds. The world represented by, the Zionist ethos, the successful labor Zionist view of the world, and the old world represented by the Chazon Ish are meeting. And Ben Gurion basically asks the Chazon Ish a basic question, which is, how is it that we together, people who don't believe, are not committed to the halacha, but are committed to the Jewish people, and people who are committed to halacha and the mitzvot and shomrei Torah mitzvahs, how can we live together in one state without killing each other? That's basically the question that Ben Gurion asks the Chazon Ish. And they meet for about, about 2 hours. It's from all indication, again, there's a lot of revisionist history out there about this meeting because people like to, present, there's all these kind of crazy stories about how the Chazon Ish wouldn't look at Ben Gurion because he was a Russia, and it's not true. There's none of that is true as far as we know from the people who are actually at the meeting. If you actually read the accounts of, there were three people at the meeting, including Ben Gurion's right-hand man, his secretary, Yitzchak Navon, who eventually became the president of Israel. And he has recordings of, unless you think the man is lying, there's no indication. So a contemporary account. They met. It was a very pleasant meeting. Ben Gurion writes in his journals, it was very pleasant. There was no shouting. There was no, pounding on the table. It was a very pleasant meeting. Basically, in response to this question, Chazon Ish, about the idea that there is, in this conflict, when there is certain things which are unnegotiable, they're non-negotiable. And so he basically says, he quotes the famous Gemara in Sanhedrin. That's what everybody knows. The Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us in the about if two gmalim, if two camels are walking up, and one is very loaded down, and the other one is not loaded down, and they come to a very narrow straight, and so the one that's not loaded down should let the one that's very loaded down go first, because it has a lot of burdens on it, and because it has a lot of burdens on it, it needs to go faster to be able to get to its destination. And so Chazon Ish was trying to imply, as was understood, that the religious Jew has many, many obligations. Kashrus, Shabbos, Nida, all these different restrictions that make, that require, if we're going to be able to live together, there has to be a certain accommodation from those who don't have that same burden, right? Like we all understand, someone who doesn't keep kosher can eat non-kosher food and kosher food. Someone who doesn't keep Shabbos, so it's not a big deal, or they can drive, or they can have their telephone on or not have their telephone. But someone who keeps Shabbos as an obligation, someone who keeps kashrus as an obligation, they don't have that leeway. And therefore, if there are accommodations that have to be made for the Jewish people to live together in one state productively, many of those accommodations are going to have to come from the side that has less obligations. That's the way Chazon Ish basically put it. He didn't explain everything. Now, I just want to make an aside here, and then get back to answer your question. Unfortunately, what the Chazon Ish said at the time was then repeated in a certain way that is that has taken on a life of its own, and that's probably not what the Chazon Ish intended. At least according to most scholars of this story. In the popular perception, both in the Chiloni world, in the secular world, and in the chareidi world, what Chazon Ish said to Ben Gurion was, first of all, he said, in the version that is quoted, it was that if there are two wagons coming, the Gemara in Sanhedrin doesn't talk about wagons. It talks about gmalim. It talks about camels, number one. So it's already okay. There's a Yerushalmi that may have this version, that has this version, but it's hard to imagine the Chazon Ish wasn't just quoting the most famous version of this. Okay? So in the version that's popularized, Chazon Ish said, one wagon is full and one wagon is empty. And so the wagon which is full, it has precedence over the wagon which is empty, which became translated into modern Hebrew as agala reika, implying that secular Jewry and secular Israel is empty. It has nothing. It has no values. It has not. And so many Chilonim were very, very offended when this story was printed, and it's still used today as, the religious people, they're very, what's the term in English? They're very condescending, that we have all the truth and we have all the values and you're just empty. You just like to smoke and do drugs and like you have no values. Now, according to the story, so that's why it's a little bit of a distortion. That's not what I don't think Hazon Ish intended to offend Ben Gurion in that way, in any way, shape, or form. It's not smart also. And the Hazon Ish was a very smart man. It's not a smart way to engage with people. So Ben Gurion responded at the time that, I don't agree with you. My community also has obligations. What about the obligations? We also carry a burden of obligations to settle the land, to absorb all of these refugees, to fight in the army. Meaning, Ben Gurion was saying that for him, these Zionist values are not just, optional. They're a chiyuv. They're an obligation. The army is not just I can eat kosher or not kosher. That's not this. This is an obligation in Jewish history. We have to resettle the land. We have to set up a state. This is not an optional thing anymore. This is a chiyuv of being a modern day Jew. So you had two very conflicting perceptions of what are, so to speak, the modern day obligations of a Jewish nation and a Jewish polity, therefore a Jewish individual. What's fascinating is that Ben Gurion and Hazon Ish did not speak at that meeting about conscription of girls. I don't think they got to it. Either Ben Gurion didn't want to, so to speak, discuss it directly at the point. He first wanted to have an initial meeting about the fundamental question of how we get along as a society. And maybe in subsequent meetings, he thought that maybe there would be some petach, some opening to discuss practical issues. But it's a very interesting thing. And Ben Gurion himself, in his later journals, concurs that they did not discuss this topic directly, even though it was in the background of why they were coming together. What's very fascinating is that at one point, Ben Gurion writes in his journals that the Hazon Ish said to him that, in a very pleasant way, not with anger or anything, but you should know that there are things that the chareidi community, the religious community, sees as red lines and it's willing to give its life for, that it's not going to back down on. And Ben Gurion urged from that meeting, he writes that's what I wrote my article about, and subsequently that he didn't feel that Hazon Ish fully grasped what his perception, Ben Gurion's perception, convey, and that he didn't see Ben Gurion, didn't see Hazon Ish as someone who was going to compromise on things that he felt were, so to speak, red lines for him and his community.
Okay, so they had this encounter and it was widely covered and so forth. But what you surfaced in your article was that there was an epilogue or a continuation of this relationship that is not widely known.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that and how extensive was their correspondence after this? What sort of issues did they discuss? And, what ultimately, how far did this relationship extend ultimately and for how long?
Right. So basically, Hazon Ish continued a number of weeks after this meeting. Hazon Ish wrote a letter to Ben Gurion, and there he did address directly the issue of conscription of women, of religious girls, and basically it's a very nice letter. What's interesting about the letter is that he does not address Ben Gurion from a religious point of view. He tries to make it very practical, and he uses what we would call today liberal democratic arguments. He says, you, Mr. Ben Gurion, you believe in freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. This is something that you should appreciate and allow, therefore, people to follow their conscience and be exempt from something that violates their most deeply held principles. Again, Hazon Ish was very, very smart. He doesn't say to him, tznius, this, that. He talks about it, and he couches it in terms that I think he believed, you could say naively, not naive, that's your own assessment, that he thought could move Ben Gurion. He also made a very smart calculation. At the time of the initial meeting, Ben Gurion's coalition, there were issues. There were some questions. Would the religious Zionists pull out? Or would this one pull out, etc.? And therefore, Hazon Ish hints in the letter, he doesn't say it, but he basically hints in the letter that, in a certain sense, if Ben Gurion had come out of the meeting from the Hazon Ish saying that he was going to now exempt the religious girls from conscription, that would have caused them a tremendous amount of political headaches from the left. And they would have said, oh, you caved in to the Hazon Ish, you caved into the religious parties. But now that a few weeks later, you don't need the religious parties for your coalition, because the religious parties had already left the coalition. He had a stable coalition without the religious parties. Basically, there's not going to be political fallout that you are caving into the religious parties. And so it's actually now a good time to be able to do this. Ben Gurion responded that, again, he appreciated the letter. At the same time, he reiterated his views about this, about the fact that, this is a critical thing for the state of Israel, and he wasn't going to pull back on this. We know from time to time they didn't continue to have a lot of letters, but we do know from other letters that Ben Gurion wrote that and things that he wrote in his journal that he was very on a personal level, he held the Hazon Ish in great esteem, and he would mention that to others. In addition, we have some letters where he's discussing with Rav Maimon this encounter that he had with the Hazon Ish, and Rav Maimon says to him, Rav Maimon was one of the heads of the Mizrahi, that he didn't think it was productive to speak anymore to the Hazon Ish, but he thought somebody who you might find more productive is to speak to the Panovich Rav Kahneman, who was definitely much more leaning to Zionism, if anybody knows the history of Panovich, at least in those days. And anybody knows the Panovich Rav was a much more open kind of person. I don't think Rav Maimon would have been right in the sense that eventually, I think the Panovich also saw himself as kafuf, as subservient to the Hazon Ish, but that's what Rav Maimon suggested to Ben Gurion. We also have a number of indications. Ben Gurion, a number of chareidi politicians from time to time would send him, books. And one of the books they sent him was when the first version of the Igrot of the Hazon Ish, the Igaras Hazon Ish, came out, and he was very moved by some of the writings of the Hazon Ish and how a deep soul the Chazon Ish had. We have indications, we know from the protocols, the Chazon Ish did not live many years longer. If I'm not mistaken, the Chazon Ish died in late 1954 or early 1955. So we don't have a lot of I mean, you can look it up. I don't know exactly when the Chazon Ish died, but the Chazon Ish did not live many years longer after these encounters with Ben Gurion and the initial back and forth and the letter to that encounter. And so we don't have a lot, but we do know that on the day that Chazon Ish died, Ben Gurion took a moment of silence before the cabinet meeting on that Sunday morning that was going to be the funeral of the Chazon Ish, and said, a great Gadol b'Yisrael died today, and therefore we take a moment of recognizing that, which again I think is very fascinating. Someone who was not necessarily very sympathetic to religion in general terms, saw it in political terms. He had to accommodate the fact that there were religious Jews in the state, and there was religious communities and religious parties especially, and he often wanted them in the coalition because he thought it would be good to have a broad coalition, not a narrow coalition. But he certainly, I think on a personal level, respected Chazon Ish greatly, spoke about him as a spiritual person, spoke about him. I think he was moved by some of the things he read. Someone sent him a copy of the Emunah Ubitachon, the very classic work of the Chazon Ish, and he also was he writes very positive that book as well. And he says that this is the kind of book that every person in Israel should read or study. Every child in Israel should study, which is a very fascinating kind of a thing for someone like that to say. It's from an old guard, even if I'm not going to even if I don't believe in God, but the lyricism of the writing and the ideas, etc., and the psychology and all those things, I think moved Ben Gurion very much. And I think it's a fascinating window. And again, I lay out many of the details in that short article. It's a fascinating window at a time. I think it also has a lot of the seeds. To me, what stood out to me when I did the research is that line that Chazon Ish says that, there are things that we are willing to die for. There are red lines that we won't cross. Which to me, very much echoed when you see some of the debates today and some of the hafganot, some of the demonstrations amongst the more radical elements in the chareidi community against conscription in our day and age in Israel. And people say something like, namut velo nigayes, will die rather than be conscripted. Again, I don't know if the Chazon Ish would have signed on in terms of men, or I don't want to project that into his mouth. But again, I think there's a certain statement there about, if you believe this is a red line that is impenetrable, then you have echoes of that already, in some of the rhetoric going back to the late 40s and early 50s in some of the initial conflicts in the state of Israel.
I was going to ask you, are there lessons that we can take from this meeting, whether positive, negative, or otherwise, that one could project forward into our current moment?
Right. So, I'm not sure. I think, first of all, the first lesson is that there has to be some mutual respect between people and the way that they interact with each other for anything to get done, and be willing to talk to each other and have conversations, I think, is a very important thing, and not demonize each other is an important thing. I also think it's a different time in the sense that, as they say, yachsei kochot, it's not the same as the early 1950s. The chareidi community is not some little defensive community that's about to be run over by this juggernaut of the state. It's 25%, who knows, of the Jewish population in the land of Israel. It's a very different situation. And so I'm not sure that that kind of, pleading, special pleading works. I think there's a different, today, the chareidi community is an integral part ultimately, if the state of Israel is going to survive, the chareidi community is, hundreds of thousands, if not a million of people. And so it's, I personally, I think it's not necessarily the same situations, and therefore maybe different tactics have to apply. And you can't just look for, okay, other people will take care of everything. Because Chazon Ish also, he never said, oh, we don't need an army. We never find in any of the rhetoric the Chazon Ish says, oh, there's no need for an army. Torah will, protect us all, so we don't need. That's not the language that he uses. Today, it's a very different situation, and so I'm not sure how much we can derive, except the idea that people need to talk to each other and recognize each other and speak to each other with respect. I think is an important value that we can take for any debate.
Do we see that, in modern Israel, as far as you can tell, that there are secular leaders who are meeting? I mean, obviously, Netanyahu is on the right, and therefore his coalition is largely
right
predicated. He clearly has relationships with Hasidic,
right,
Rebbes and all of that kind of thing. Again, one could be quite cynical about that in terms of the real politic. But on the left, you see those relationships existing at all?
I think that there are things going on behind the scenes. I think there are. I think it becomes very hard because, again, this is just my personal views. I think that, like Newton's laws, every action causes a reaction. And when X Rav says this about the Tzahal, and then so people get excited and they say this about the chareidi community, and the chareidi community gets excited. There's a lot of, and of course, October 7th and the tremendous burden that so many of the reservists have carried has changed the calculus. Meaning, Israel's wars were always very short. Always very short. They weren't always 6 days, but they were. The Yom Kippur War was 3 months. The Lebanon War was 2.5 months. The Sinai campaign was 3 weeks. The world, it's a totally different situation. And I think that's also changed the reality. I do think that there was some attempt by some people in the left to try to find some vehicle for compromise. But, all these things, you need really two to tango. I think that some of the most extreme elements on each side of these issues are, push the mainstream not to find, the solutions that I think are possible if people are willing to do some real compromises, not just cosmetic compromises. But that would require a lot of leadership, and people don't want to be attacked by extremists and stuff like that. But, yeah.
I'm struck by, perhaps it's a function of the time, a feature of the time. In the mid-1950s, the options for correspondence were a personal meeting and then a letter writing. And something about letter writing, right, forces a certain deliberateness, a certain respect. I think, it's a different kind of medium, certainly contrasted with social media, but even just in general with the, a column that a person writes online or things of that nature. The medium itself is today is far more disposed towards harsh rhetoric, towards polarization. And I think when you're writing somebody a letter, sitting down, it creates, it engenders a different emotional tenor to it. And I think maybe that alone, just the method and the mode of communication itself, both whether it's face-to-face or letter writing, somewhat captured and maybe again engendered the differences in the manner of interactions.
Yeah, not only that, I think you're 100% correct, but I also think, remember, people didn't live as separately as we live today in Israel. This idea of, cities that they're only chareidi, or cities that are only religious Zionist, or cities only chiloni, or cities that are only Arab. People lived much more cheek by jowl. You talk to people, B'nai Brak, that this is a funny thing, but I have friends, I'm 61 years old. So I have friends, Israeli friends who grew up in Bnei Brak, religious Zionists. At one time, the biggest sniff of Bnei Akiva was in Bnei Brak in Israel. Isn't that funny? Meaning
Indeed.
it was a different world, and people lived. Geula was a mixed neighborhood in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Only in the 70s and 80s it became only religious people living in Geula, and in Yerushalayim. So like people lived next to each other. People may have even worked more next to each other. People may have interacted more with each other. They would have seen each other. I think that's also a problem. I think the siloing of the way that we live, the newspapers that we read, like you said, the social media that we read, the interactions that we have are very different.
Well, we can only hope that perhaps people quietly will be getting together in some back rooms and having these dignified conversations, and maybe they'll sit down and write letters to each other, or at least try to summon the same kind of energies that it requires to do that in order to have those critical conversations. Because at the current approach is certainly not doesn't seem to be working in anyone's interest, chareidi, chiloni, or anything in between. So a lot to learn from this fascinating historical encounter. And of course, you can read about it, and we'll link to in the show notes. Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot on the Lehrhaus, Gurion and Hazon Ish, the sequel, published originally on November 19th, 2025. Rabbi Helfgot, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Rabbi, and I wish you well on continued podcasting. I assume you do other things besides podcasting, so I wish you hatzlacha there also, where you can actually make a living also off of it.
Thank you so much. I'm made to that for sure.
Okay.
All the best.